So here's the thing about being the only human diplomat in the Galactic Council. It's not really a glamorous gig. Sure, it sounds impressive when you tell your friends back on Earth, "Oh yeah, I'm literally representing the entire human species at intergalactic negotiations." But the reality is mostly sitting through 7-hour lectures about trade tariffs in a conference room that smells like recycled air and broken dreams. But I'm getting ahead of myself. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Let me back up. My name is Marcus, and I work for the Diplomatic Corps of Earth. Don't ask me why I volunteered for this post. I blame a combination of naivety, a severe lack of self-preservation instinct, and whatever they were serving in the cafeteria the day they asked me. Probably the cafeteria thing. It was a really good sandwich. Anyway, here I was, standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of Zephyr Station, which is basically a massive floating platform where all the major species of the galaxy come together to pretend they like each other while actually just jockeying for resources and political power. You know, like the United Nations, but with tentacles and exoskeletons and a lot more incomprehensible legal jargon. The Quilvarans were presenting their latest proposal on energy trade regulations. Now, let me tell you something about Quilvarans. They're tall, they're slender, they have these delicate crystalline structures all over their bodies that make them look like they were carved out of a geode. And, this is the important part, they are phenomenally boring speakers. And I'm not just saying that. The Quilvaran delegate, whose name I could never pronounce, had been talking for what felt like 3 hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Time moves differently when you're slowly dying inside. I was standing there in full diplomatic regalia, which is to say I was wearing a suit that cost more than a small starship and was approximately 7 times less comfortable. My feet were killing me. My neck had developed this weird twitch. And I was pretty sure I was developing a stress rash under my collar. This was day 3 of the Energy Trade Summit. Day 3, we had 4 more days scheduled. 4 more days of this nonsense. And then presumably, I could return to the tiny human quarters they'd assigned me and cry in a way that would not create an international incident. That's when the Cubs arrived. The Cubs were a species the Council had only recently integrated. They're called Repulians officially, but everyone called them the Cubs. This was partly because there were only a handful of them, which made them seem small and vulnerable, and partly because they literally looked like puppies that had been designed by committee. They had these enormous dark eyes, floppy ears, and an inexplicable innocence about everything that made you want to protect them from the harsh realities of the universe. There were 3 of them that day. The lead diplomat, who went by Krell, though I'm pretty sure that was a nickname, had brought along 2 younger ones, probably junior diplomats or maybe just trainees. Nobody really knew. The Repulians hadn't been with the Council long enough to establish clear hierarchies that anyone else could understand. They came bustling in late to the session, apologizing profusely in their high-pitched, adorable voices, and the Quilvaran delegate, without breaking rhythm, might I add, just waved a long crystalline hand at them to sit down. So they did. And where did they sit? Right next to me. Because apparently, the Repulians had decided that they liked humans. This was partly because I'd made the mistake of smiling at them during the opening ceremony, and I guess that translated to, "Let's be best friends forever," in Repulian culture. Krell plopped down in the seat beside me and immediately turned to whisper something to the younger Cubs, gesturing toward the Quilvaran delegate with obvious boredom. The older of the 2 younger ones whom I'd later learn was called Miska, actually stifled what could only be described as a snicker. The younger one, Pello, just looked confused, which honestly, same. The Quilvaran delegate continued talking. Something about Article 7, subsection 12, regarding the redistribution of stellar energy credits across species with differing consumption rates. I was taking notes because that's what diplomatic professionals do, even when their brain has essentially turned into pudding. I noticed Krell pulling out what looked like a small, handheld device. Oh no, I thought. Please don't start playing games. Please don't make this weirder than it already is. But Krell wasn't playing games. Krell was reading, or at least that's what it looked like. Some kind of digital document on their little device, their eyes tracking back and forth in that methodical way that suggested profound concentration. The two younger cubs, Miska and Pello, were a different story. They kept poking each other and making these tiny squeaking sounds that they clearly thought nobody else could hear. Spoiler alert, everyone could hear them. The Zephax representative 3 seats down kept glancing over with this expression that suggested they were evaluating whether the Repulians were going to become a long-term problem. About halfway through the Quilvaran's explanation of the mandatory compliance protocols, oh yes, we were still going, dear reader. This lecture was like an aggressive fungal infection that would not stop spreading. I felt a slight weight on my right shoulder. I looked over. Pello, the youngest of the 3 cubs, was slowly, very slowly, leaning toward my shoulder like a falling tree in a forest that nobody was around to witness. His eyes were getting heavier by the second. His tongue was lolling out just a tiny bit. The little guy was absolutely passing out. My first instinct was to gently nudge him back upright. That's the kind of thing you do, right? You don't let diplomats fall asleep on you. That's unprofessional. That's asking for an interstellar incident. That's probably in some clause of the diplomatic charter, subsection something or other, about maintaining composure and proper boundaries. But I hesitated. Because here's the thing. Pello, despite being a fully certified diplomat, was absolutely tiny. Probably not even up to my shoulder naturally. He was straining just to rest his head on the edge of my shoulder. His little ears, those big floppy ones, were drooping as his consciousness slowly powered down. And there was something so utterly innocent, so completely defenseless about the moment, that I found myself utterly unable to move. Also, let me be honest here. After 3 days of this summit, after literally countless hours of standing around in this too tight suit, listening to different variations on the same economic arguments, I was desperate for something, anything, that would make this bearable. A sleeping alien puppy on my shoulder suddenly seemed like the most acceptable thing that had happened all day. So I didn't move. I just let him sleep. But then something miraculous happened. Miska, seeing his friend finally surrendering to unconsciousness, apparently decided that this was the winning strategy. Not 5 minutes later, Miska was also drifting off, this time leaning on Krell, who didn't even look up from their reading material. Krell just took one long-fingered hand, reached over, and gently steadied Miska's head to make the position more comfortable. Like this was a normal Tuesday evening at Repulian diplomatic headquarters. I almost laughed. Almost. I suppressed it because I am a professional, despite all evidence to the contrary. The Quilvaran was still talking. They were now on Article 8, subsection 3, regarding the penalties for non-compliance. Their voice had taken on that droning quality that suggests they might actually be reading directly from a legal document without even bothering to translate it into anything approaching conversational speech. Krell kept reading. Pello was now fully asleep on my shoulder, his little body completely relaxed, his breathing soft and even. Miska was slumped against Krell in a position that looked awkward, but apparently was comfortable enough for unconsciousness. And me? I was standing there like a statue, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too heavily, terrified that any movement on my part would disrupt this delicate ecosystem. The thing nobody tells you about being a diplomat is that sometimes the most important work you do has nothing to do with trade agreements or policy proposals. Sometimes it's just creating a safe space, or in this case, a safe shoulder, for someone who desperately needs to rest, even if that someone is an adorable alien puppy. And the shoulder in question belongs to a human who looks absolutely ridiculous standing here like this. I caught the Zephax representative staring at me. They had this expression that was hard to read, what with the compound eyes and the chitinous face. But I was pretty sure it was some form of amusement. The Quilvaran delegate finally reached Article 9 and announced a 15-minute break. The entire assembly seemed to collectively sigh with relief. Delegates started standing up, stretching, moving around. This was supposed to be the moment where everything changed, where the careful tableau I'd constructed would shatter. But it didn't. Because there was this unspoken understanding that had fallen over the room. Everyone could see what was happening. Everyone could see that two young Repulian diplomats were fast asleep, and that moving them would not only be tremendously disruptive, but also somewhat cruel. And somehow, without any formal declaration, without any official protocol, every single delegate in that room had decided that this was going to happen. The Zephax rep walked past and just kind of nodded at me. A Krillian merchant, aggressive, territorial, not known for their patience, just smiled. An elderly Torvin, ancient and wise, actually reached out and very gently straightened Miska's position to make sure the young Repulian was more comfortable. Krell looked up from their reading and met my eye. They had this soft expression that transcended species barriers. It was the universal look of someone who understands that sleep-deprived youngsters need to be allowed to rest, and the universe can wait for its bureaucratic procedures. I mouthed, "Is this okay?" Krell made a gesture that might have been a shrug or might have been a Repulian expression of gratitude. Definitely one of those. Probably gratitude. They returned to their reading, apparently entirely unbothered by the fact that their junior diplomats were using human and Repulian shoulders as pillows. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The Quilvaran delegate seemed to be having a lengthy conversation with a Xanthian trade minister about something. I gathered that the meeting might be delayed a bit longer. Great, excellent. More time for me to stand here like a statue. Pello shifted slightly in his sleep, nestling deeper into my shoulder in a way that was almost absurdly cute. His little paw, okay, it's technically a hand, but it's basically a paw, curled up against my suit jacket. And I realized, with a sudden rush of something I can only describe as unexpected paternal instinct, that I was absolutely not going to move. Not now. Not when he'd finally found a comfortable position, not when he was sleeping so peacefully. This was the moment, I realized, that I became a diplomat in the truest sense of the word. Not because of any treaties I was going to sign or any policies I was going to negotiate, but because I was willing to stand here in an uncomfortable suit, with my feet killing me and that weird neck twitch still going strong, just so that a small sleeping alien puppy could get some rest. The Quilvaran finally signaled that they were ready to resume. The delegates started filtering back to their seats. I tensed up, waiting for the moment of chaos and confusion, when everyone would realize that the cubs were still asleep and something would have to be done about it. But then something extraordinary happened. Every single delegate walked back to their seat, carefully, quietly, deliberately. They moved like people walking through a library after hours. The SCI-FI rep even slowed their normally rapid clicking gait to something softer, less aggressive. Even the Krillian, who had been in the middle of some kind of argument with a Torvan, suspended their hostilities and made their way back in near silence. The Quilvaran looked at the scene. Two young Repulians, asleep on a human and another Repulian, and for a moment, I thought we were going to have a problem. The Quilvarans are very formal, very strict about protocol. Sleeping during a session is generally considered extremely disrespectful. But the Quilvaran delegate, after a long moment of crystalline consideration, simply began again. Quietly, not in that aggressive droning tone from before, but in something almost gentle. Article 9, subsection 1, regarding the long-term sustainability of energy distribution models. The delegate was basically giving them a pass. I couldn't believe it. I looked around the room to see if anyone else was experiencing this same sense of cosmic bewilderment. The SCI-FI rep caught my eye and actually winked. A literal wink, from a being with compound eyes. I didn't even know they could wink, but apparently they could, and apparently they were doing it at me right now. And I got it then. I understood what was happening. We were all tired, all of us. Every single delegate in this room had been sitting through the same boring meetings for the same 3 days. We all had different agendas, different political motivations, different species-based priorities. We were all here to advance our own interests and those of our people. But we were also, for just a moment, united by something simpler. The cubs were young. They were still learning. And they were so absolutely, completely exhausted that their bodies had simply overridden their brains and forced them to sleep despite their best efforts to stay awake and do their jobs. And every single one of us in that room recognized that feeling. Every single one of us had been there. And more than that, watching them sleep, their little bodies completely relaxed and trusting, had reminded us all of something we'd maybe forgotten in the midst of all the political maneuvering and economic posturing. There was something decent about protecting the vulnerable, something that transcended species lines and cultural differences. By letting the cubs sleep, we weren't just being nice. We were making a statement. We were saying, yes, we have disagreements. Yes, we're negotiating hard for our interests. But we're also going to be civilized about it. We're also going to recognize that sometimes the most important thing is to let someone rest. The lecture continued, and somehow it wasn't quite as unbearable anymore. Maybe it was just the fact that I had an adorable alien on my shoulder. Maybe it was the knowledge that I wasn't alone in my exhaustion, that the whole room had collectively decided to be better than the bare minimum. Maybe it was the sound of Pello's soft breathing, a little reminder that there was something worthwhile about all of this bureaucratic nightmare. 2 hours later, Pello stirred. His little eyes fluttered open, and he looked around in confusion for a moment, trying to figure out where he was. Then his gaze landed on me, and I watched understanding slowly dawn on his face. He'd fallen asleep on a human. He was probably terrified that this was going to be a huge diplomatic incident. I just smiled and nodded like, yeah, buddy, it's fine. Totally fine. Everyone's cool with it. His little face broke into the biggest grin I've ever seen. Then he carefully extricated himself from my shoulder, looked back at me one more time like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and nudged Miska awake. Miska jolted upright, momentarily disoriented, but Krell just patted the youngster on the head in a gesture that said, "Yeah, you snoozed, and that was fine. Everyone's chill about it." The Quilvaran delegate concluded the day's session shortly after, and I swear I could see what might have been satisfaction in their crystalline features. Maybe they'd wanted to wrap this up anyway, and the peaceful solution of letting everyone calm down had actually helped. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. Diplomacy is 70% reading into things that might not be there, so I'm probably on brand. As everyone was leaving, the Zephax rep actually came over and tapped me on the shoulder with one of their chitinous appendages. "That was excellent work," they said in that clicky-voiced language of theirs that the universal translator rendered as some kind of encouraging pat on the back. Holding the young ones while they rested. That's the kind of diplomacy that builds real relationships. I stared at them in confusion. I literally just stood here. I didn't do anything. "Exactly," the Zephax rep said, and then clicked away before I could respond. Krell came over as I was removing my jacket, because honestly, I'd been wearing it too long and needed to air out the suit situation. "Thank you," Krell said simply, "for letting them sleep." "Of course," I replied. "They were exhausted." "Yes, but you didn't have to allow it," Krell pointed out. "You could have woken them, moved them, insisted on protocol." "Yeah, well, where's the diplomacy in that?" I said, and I meant it. What's the point of being diplomatic if we can't just let some sleeping cubs lie? Krell made this soft chirping sound that I'm pretty sure was laughter. "I think your species might have something to teach us after all," they said. "Humans get a reputation for being aggressive, for being warlike and self-interested. But there's something beneath that, isn't there? Some kind of capacity for just letting things be okay." I hadn't really thought about it that way, but now that Krell mentioned it, I guess there was something to that. Humanity's whole thing is this weird combination of fierce competitive drive and deep compassion. We'll fight for resources, but we'll also take in strays. We'll negotiate hard for every advantage, but we'll also step back and let someone else win if they need it more. We're contradictory like that. Frustratingly, gloriously contradictory. Pello bounded over, literally bounded like a puppy, which again, kind of fitting for the nickname Cubs, and hugged my leg. For a moment, I was concerned about the diplomatic ramifications of physical contact from a junior Repulian to a human representative. Then I decided, hang it all, and reached down to pet the little guy's head. His whole body vibrated with what I can only describe as pure joy. "They'll want to sleep on you again tomorrow, you know," Krell said, and I could hear the amusement in their voice. "If you allow it. The rest days are always hardest for the young ones. They get tired from trying to be professional when their bodies want to rest." I looked at Pello, still vibrating with joy, and then at Miska, who was hovering behind, also looking hopeful. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I think I can work with that." And that's how I became, unofficially, the Repulian Cubs' designated napping location for the rest of the Energy Trade Summit. Every afternoon, around the 3-hour mark of whatever was being discussed, they'd sidle over to my seat. Krell would give me an approving nod, and I'd become an impromptu pillow for 2 extremely grateful young aliens. The weird thing? Everyone knew this was happening. Every single delegate was aware that I was the Cubs' nap buddy. And somehow, it changed the entire tone of the summit. We still negotiated hard. We still argued about tariffs and compliance protocols and all the boring stuff. But there was this underlying understanding now that we were all doing this because we had to, not because we wanted to turn each other into space dust. The presence of two little alien cubs napping peacefully in the middle of it all was like this constant reminder of what we were actually trying to accomplish. A stable galaxy where all species could coexist peacefully. By the time the summit ended, on day 7, yes, they added an extra day. But it was actually productive, so nobody minded. The Repulians had become something of a galactic darling. Every delegate wanted to pat them on the head, to share treats with them, to hear about their experiences. They went from being those cute new species to being those adorable and apparently very peaceful new species who make all of us want to be better. And it started because I let them sleep on my shoulder. On my last day before returning to Earth, Pello brought me something. A small carved token made from what looked like polished starstone. It had the outline of a human figure and a Repulian figure standing together. The human's hand resting gently on the smaller alien's head. From all of us, Krell explained. To remember that diplomacy isn't always about the big speeches and the fancy agreements. Sometimes it's about the quiet moments, the moments where you just let someone rest. I held that token in my hand and realized something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of this job. I'd come to the Galactic Council thinking it was all about proving that humans deserved a seat at the table, that we were smart and capable and worthy of respect. Turns out, what mattered more was showing that we were kind, that we were willing to step back sometimes to make space for others, to let our guard down and just be present for someone who needed us. That's the thing about humans that I think other species were still figuring out. We're complex in a way that's hard to pin down. We'll compete viciously, but we'll also sacrifice. We'll fight for what we believe in, but we'll also change our minds if we see a better way. We'll stand in an uncomfortable suit for hours just so that two little aliens could get some sleep. We're kind of a mess, honestly. But maybe that mess is our strength. Maybe it's the thing that makes us uniquely capable of building bridges instead of walls. The Zephax rep came by to see me off at the docking bay. They handed me a small communication device. The Cubs email, the Zephax said. They wanted to stay in touch. Apparently, you made quite the impression on them. I took the device, looking at it with a mix of amusement and affection. Thanks. Tell them I'll write. And Marcus? The Zephax added as I was turning to leave. When you go back to Earth, tell your people this. Tell them that we're not as different as we think. That somewhere out in the galaxy, there are creatures who appreciate gentleness, who recognize kindness, who understand that sometimes the most powerful diplomacy is just letting someone sleep on your shoulder while you work things out. I nodded, holding that carved token close to my chest as I boarded the ship back to Earth. Maybe the Cubs fell asleep on my shoulder that day during the lecture. Maybe nobody dared wake them because waking them would have broken something important. But really, what happened was that I woke up to what diplomacy could really be, to what humanity could really be. And that, I realized, made all the difference. I'd tell you what happened at the next summit. But that's a story for another time. Let's just say the Cubs have already requested that I bring back some Earth snacks next time. And apparently, that's the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in intergalactic relations in the last 100 years. Who knew that a bag of chocolate chip cookies could change the course of galactic history? But I'm getting ahead of myself again. End of transmission. This is Marcus, human diplomat, professional pillow, and apparently interstellar bridge builder, signing off. And yeah, I'm definitely keeping this job.